Okay, hi Sociology 271 and welcome to week 2 of the class. I'm broadcasting here from the old rail beds in the Ritchie neighborhood. You may hear birds flying around or little kids running by. So it's a pleasant afternoon. So we're embarking on week 2. This is the first of 2 weeks, week 2 and week 3, where we're going to talk a lot about the historical backdrop against which many changes and trends in Canadian families today are playing out. So in this week, I'm going to do something kind of ridiculous in the lecture, which is I'm going to attempt to talk about the big, length of time from the 18th century through to the Second World War in 1 week's lecture. So obviously, I'm going to be talking in a lot of big generalizations with probably not enough specificities. I'm going to talk about how sociologists have studied or have analyzed the way big historical trends affect families, marriages, parent-child relationships, kind of in general, things like wars and economic recessions and big changes in technology and production. And then I'm going to kind of zoom in on Canada and work through several themes that are prominent in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. Few administrative details, as you know from reading the syllabus. If your student number ends in 2, 3, or 4, that means that you are responsible for coming up with at least 5 questions on the material here, questions that go beyond the material, not just like what was the population in 1853 or what have you, but that are questions that explore a little bit further. You're responsible for generating those and making sure that they are submitted to the appropriate folder on eClass by the end of the day on Wednesday. And then that means on Thursday I'll be able to look them over and answer some of them for the benefit of everybody. You also have 2 choices for films to watch this week. Content warning, they deal with residential schools, so some of the material may be difficult to watch. One is a documentary that was done by the CBC, and the other is a fictional account that was made about 40 years ago in Canada with some very well-known Indigenous actors about the experiences of a kid in residential school. So with that out of the way, here we go. As always, the content of this lecture belongs to me, Amy Kaler, and no one is supposed to reproduce it, duplicate it, copy it, alter it, change it, etc. without my permission in writing. So now that we've got that out of the way, we're off to the lecture, and I look forward to seeing you online over the course of the week. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to week 2. So this is the first of a couple of weeks in which we'll talk about the historical trajectories of families in Canada. In this first week, we'll start with the 18th century, and we'll move forwards in time to just after the Second World War. And then next week, we'll pick up after the Second World War and kind of bring ourselves up to date with the 21st century. So here we go. Okay, here's what we're going to cover in this lecture. We're going to do it in 6 sections. The first is a sort of general discussion of what we think of as big picture changes, like major historical processes that take place over long periods of time and affect millions of people, some of the ways in which these typically around the world have an impact on families and family life. And then with that background, we're going to talk about First Nations and European contact in terms mainly of how this influenced families both among the settlers and among the Indigenous people who were in Canada when the settlers arrived. Some of that story is a story of cooperation and mutual support and learning, but more often, as you'll see in the third section, it is unfortunately a story of power and domination and the suppression, if not destruction, of many First Nations families. We're then going to talk about another big historical, long-term, multi-year, large-scale change in Canada, which is the urbanization of the country um, from the sort of mid to late 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century, which kind of sets the backdrop for a lot of what we see today. In a fifth section, we'll talk about another one of these sort of backdrop big long-term trends, which is patterns in immigration. I'll pick those up again after Second World War in the next week's lectures. And then finally, the last of our big long-term, big pattern trends in Canadian history, social reform movements, which changed the way people thought about spouses, children, parenting, and so forth as part of a broad, like many-decade movement changing the ways that people lived in their homes. So here we go. Okay, families and big picture changes. So how do sort of macro-social changes affect families? And by macro-social, I mean things that go beyond the level of just one community or one city or even just one generation, but that are really big things that unfold. Obviously, everything's going to be different at different times in different places, but here's a few examples of big sort of macro level changes that affect families. War, for example. War and peace are known, sociologists have demonstrated this over and over again, that they have a big impact on marriage rates. Typically, marriage rates go down during a war. People kind of put their plans to get married and form households on hold while there's a war actively going on, and then they go up afterwards. And we're going to see this really clearly with the baby boom in the next week's lecture. Same thing with childbearing. When there's war or massive civil unrest going on, people typically put their parenting plans on hold for the duration, so you have a drop in birth rates, and then there's a big uptick once some form of peace or stability returns. So that's one way that big changes affect families. New technologies and the process that's sort of known, you can imagine me doing like air quotes with my fingers here, as modernization, also have impacts on families that sociologists have documented around the world. And these new technologies can be everything from the Industrial Revolution centuries ago, which moved production of goods out of the home and into non-home places like factories and industries and offices. That episode of new technologies actually led to much more rigid divisions of labor by gender. So that's when you see the emergence of this sort of ideology that women stay home and tend the home and the children, and men go out of the home to work and to make the money and to bring home the resources. Or when you see that becoming kind of like, this is the ideal for family life. And that came about because of technological changes in the Industrial Revolution. We're seeing similar yet different effects of big technological changes even today in the 21st century, when with the rise of what people call the mobility revolution. Cell phones, the internet, laptops, personal computers, all this stuff that nobody had 50 years ago, even 40 years ago, 30 years ago, has affected families in that it kind of collapses the division between when you're at home, and your home is your space that is not work, and your home is your kind of retreat, and when you're at work, which is geographically somewhere else, and you go there to do your work, and then you come home when you're done your work. with this revolution in technologies that collapse space, home becomes work, work becomes home. Everybody's working a lot more than they used to be, and the lines between what is private in the home and what is kind of out there in the world of work, we're finding are becoming increasingly blurred. And you guys know this really well because you are living through or have just lived through the COVID pandemic, which resulted in a lot of collapsing of these boundaries as work came home, because workplaces, many workplaces, not all were closed, and so people were working from home a whole lot more than they used to. So the COVID pandemic was like an extreme or exacerbated instance of how modernization and new technologies affect family life. Okay, other big historical processes, economic booms and recessions. If you're living somewhere like Alberta, for instance, that has a kind of boom and bust cycle, it's going to have an impact on family formation. Usually how this works out is that it affects marriage and childbearing. So during an economic boom, people marry younger, because it's easier to make enough money to be able to afford to set up your own home and so forth. They have more kids. Often this is because when there's a lot of money floating around, wages go up and it's easier for a family of two parents to get by on one income, and people buy lots of stuff. And so their houses get bigger, the places that they inhabit and live in get bigger. Look around Alberta for an example. During boom periods in Alberta, our birth rate has historically been the highest in Canada. Bust, well, everything goes the other way. People will have fewer kids. You see fewer households in which there's one adult who is in the home full time with the kids. And marriage and childbearing drops. So we have this up and down because of big historical changes. Political policies, going far, far away from Alberta, for example, some big national political policies have a big impact on families. And a really well-known example here is it's now no longer in force, but for a very long time, the one-child policy in China, which was a law, really, that couples were limited to having only one child unless they met certain conditions. There were a lot of loopholes in that law. This was meant to try to curb what was seen as excessive population growth. It did have a big impact, though, on gender relations and generational relations within families. For instance, because of a preference for male children or sons among many families, there were verified increases in infanticide or the abandonment of baby girls, and a lot of families where that one child was a boy. So the ratio of boys to girls in areas where there was a strong preference for sons became skewed beyond kind of what it is in nature. Some scholars have looked at this and have said, yeah, but follow this out a little further down the track, fast forward a few decades, and you actually find a rise in the status of girls or young women because they become scarce. Who are all these preferred sons going to marry when they become, when they're in their 20s and they're looking to marry and settle down when there aren't enough girls to go around. So some sociologists have argued that the long-term effect of the one-child policy has actually been an increase in the status of girls and women because they become sort of a rare commodity. The one-child policy also affects generational relations, that is the relationship between children and parents, between parents and grandparents, and so forth. in taking a form that's often referred to as 4-2-1. And the 4 is 4 grandparents, the 2 is 2 parents, and the 1 is 1 child resulting from all of those people. So you have a kind of, think of it as an upside down triangle of generational relations where as you go down the generations, grandparent to parent to grandchild, there are fewer and fewer people. So a greater responsibility on those grandchildren in the third generation to look after aging parents, to look after aging grandparents without being able to kind of share the burden or share the responsibility with siblings or cousins. So that's a bit of a long example, but that's an instance of how big national level policies can really affect the processes and the relationships within families. Okay, let's look at a few major trends for Canada now that we've looked at examples of how large-scale changes can affect families all over the world. First one I want to talk about is contact. Here is an example of this new family formation. It's a picture of Sophia Lolo Todd, who was what's referred to as a country wife, which means somebody, we would now call them like a common law or a domestic partner, married to a white trader who married her because she was from a prominent First Nations family. So you can read the little description here from the British Columbia archives. John Todd married Sophia Lolo. She was a whole lot younger than he was, so she was the daughter of a prominent family. They had many children together. She traveled with him. She facilitated his contacts and his interactions and his fur trading with First Nations communities throughout his career. They did not officially, in the eyes of the European church and law, get married until their own daughter was about to get married. So they were together having kids for a long time without being, legally, formally, officially married. And they passed away within a very short time of each other. So that's a family form that was brought into being by the arrival of white settlers in Western Canada. A little bit later on in time, here's an account. I actually came across this when I was working on a book on the history of birth and reproduction in Alberta. And I found a lot of accounts by white women, settlers who came to Canada and they were pregnant and they were having their first child and they had never had a child before and had no idea, because in those days people didn't talk about it too openly, what to expect or what was going on. So in this instance, a woman named Mary Lawrence wrote, this is from a letter she wrote to her sister-in-law back in the UK in 1905 about giving birth. She was having her first baby, she was in labor, she thought she knew that, a woman in labor is supposed to be lying in bed and lying on her back, and that's the best way for the baby to be born. She had a very painful, long labor, and when she was pregnant with her second child, one of her neighbors who was Indigenous said, there's a better way to do this. Don't, when labor starts, don't go to bed and lie down. Stand up, move around, stay upright, kind of get yourself into positions that are easier for giving birth, and it'll probably go better. And Mary Lawrence tried this, even though it was totally against what was the common medical advice for white women at the time, and found that labor went a lot better. And as you can see from her letter to her sister, that she was like, yes, this has helped me to have babies, and started telling her white neighbors, for childbirth, the way we've been told to do it is not that healthy. Get up, move around, and all of that stuff. So there's an instance where white families, their survival was actually facilitated by indigenous families, so the women weren't becoming really injured or even dying in childbirth. So that's all kind of, nice and sunny and so on. But unfortunately, that's not, that is very far from being the whole picture of the colonial encounter and how it affected families. The negative impacts on white settlements, on indigenous families really outweigh the positive when you take everything into account. So that if we had to kind of characterize the story of how the arrival of European settlers affected families in Canada, it would be a story of power and a story of domination and cultural harm or damage. European settlers, like everybody else probably, had their ideas about what is right and correct in terms of family forms, for instance. They believed that the only legitimate marriage is between a man and a woman, one man and one woman, for life, and that the dominant party in this marriage should be the man. And this is what, God has ordained and the way it should be. So when they encountered First Nations communities, which had different concepts of marriage, for instance, that polygamy or multiple partners within a marriage was legitimate, was okay, that marriages could be entered into and also exited fairly easily. So if a marriage wasn't working out in many First Nations communities, it was possible for the partners, the spouses, to bring it to an end fairly easily and kind of get on with life, which clashed with the European notion that marriage is, a man and a woman forever. Many First Nations communities also did not have the same rigid gender hierarchy within marriage, such that women had authority that was similar to, equal to that of their husbands in the marriage, which to many white settlers was kind of, horrifying and shocking that Indigenous women had these rights and these freedoms which settlers believed women ought not to have. As white control over Indigenous life intensified through the 19th century, this led to problems when white governments refused to recognize marriages and families that were legitimate by the laws of the First Nation communities. So, for instance, in polygamous marriages, all the wives except the first one would be considered concubines or prostitutes by the white legal authorities. And the children of those marriages, except for the children of the first wife, would be regarded as illegitimate children or bastards or children born without the protection of wedlock. So many people had their status downgraded and disrespected by the imposition of sort of white understandings, European understandings of marriage and family upon Indigenous communities. The most notorious things, which you may indeed have heard about, had to do with the removal of First Nations children from their families. And over a period of more than 100 years, there were several different modalities through which First Nations children were taken away from their families, ostensibly, and you can see me doing air quotes again, for their own good, but in reality often subjected to abuse, subjected to alienation from their culture, loss of their language, and so forth, with the result that parent-child relationships within these Indigenous communities were really
severely damaged by white authorities coming in and saying we're taking the kids away and putting them somewhere where we can teach them to be just like us. Residential schools was one of those modalities. Between the 1870s and the 1990s, last one did not close until 1996, 132 schools were established throughout Canada. It was mandatory for what then would have been called Indian children to attend these schools. It wasn't like the parents could choose to send their kids or not send their kids. They had to, produce their kid, or you would have what in the early days were known as Indian agents. Later on, these would be welfare agents coming to their homes to forcibly separate the children and take them to the residential schools, where they were not always, but often mistreated quite a bit. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, destruction of their ties to their family and community, and so forth. More than 150 children were placed in residential schools. About 80,000 they're now adults, but there's about 80,000 people alive today for whom that is a live memory, like that is something which happened to them. So it's not like this happened 100 years ago and we've gotten past it by a long shot. TB hospitals, TB is tuberculosis. We've got a picture here of the CAMSUL, which those of you who live on the north side may recognize. These were back in the day when tuberculosis was like pre-antibiotic. Getting tuberculosis was a really bad thing. Children and adolescents who had tuberculosis would be taken out of communities, particularly in the far north, and put into these hospitals for periods ranging from a few months to a few years. And that was often, again, incredibly disruptive. They were, at a very young age, separated from normal family relationships, and they were confined in hospitals because they had tuberculosis. So these TB hospitals, which have been closed down, were another means of damaging families within Indigenous communities. The 60s scoop, some of you may have heard of this. That's the name given to a policy or practice, I guess, of the Canadian federal government in the 1960s of believing that for Indigenous kids who were in families that were experiencing problems or under a lot of stresses, it would be better for the young children to be taken out of the communities and to be raised by white families, with the idea that this would somehow make them better, take them out of this circumstance, and they'd be raised in white families and they'd grow up to be just like white people. This generated enormous bitterness within Indigenous and First Nations communities who saw their children being removed and never came back. Kids were taken out of their families and told, you've got a new family now, it's this white family that we've given you to, and again, cut off, disconnected from their parents. A lot of this information about what happened to First Nations families became very public in the course of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which you may remember from 2014, where people came forward and told their stories about residential schools, about being placed in hospitals, about the 60s scoop. And had it not been for the TRC, I think a lot of this would not be as widely known as it is today. Here is an article about the 60s scoop, about the importance of adopting, described as Indian or Métis, we'd say Indigenous children, in order that they should have white parents and grow up with the advantage of being white kids. So you can take a moment just to read through that and see what you think. Okay, the next major change that I want to talk about is urbanization. And urbanization obviously refers to movement out of rural areas and small towns and into big cities. Um, Urbanization in Canada meant that rural areas were effectively depopulated. Everybody, um, let me say this another way. If you went back in time 100 years, you'd find a lot more people living in, proportionally, a lot more people, a greater chunk of the population living in rural areas or small towns than you would today in 2020. Rural areas have been depopulated. Populations have dropped in rural areas. And most of the immigration into Canada has gone into cities, making the cities even more prominent in the distribution of Canadian population than they already were. Here's what urbanization looks like. This slide, this is information from Statistics Canada and the every 5-year census. This shows you the rural population of Canada as a percentage of everybody. So if you look way back at the very beginning, it's like 87% of the population in Canada lives in a rural area. Population was much smaller than it is today, but still that's like the overwhelming majority of Canadians at the time were rural people. And then it drops and it drops and it drops and it drops and it drops until by 2011 it's not even a quarter of that. Only 19% of Canadians in 2011 live in rural areas. So that's enormous urbanization that's occurred, that's gone on in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, urbanization has been associated often with changes in gendered and generational spheres and divisions of labor. So when families moved from being on the farm, where home was work and work was home, and everybody typically had to pitch in, men, women, boys, girls, young kids, the elderly, everybody had to contribute in order to produce everything that the household needs, to an urban way of life where work and production takes place outside the home and work are distinct places. That was brought about through urbanization. And similarly, as I mentioned earlier, this division between home and work becomes gendered. Men's sphere becomes being the breadwinner, going out there and doing a job and getting paid in money, which is then used for whatever the family needs. And the woman's sphere becomes caring, nurturing, unpaid labors of love within the home. And we'll talk a lot more about this division of spheres and the gendering of the different kinds of work that's necessary for families to get by. Okay, this slide here addresses the distinction or the contrast between rural and urban families. The rural families, work is home and home is work, and there's not much of a distinction between them. The family is a consumption unit as well as a production unit. They don't just buy food and clothes and so forth. They also create it and consume it. So production and consumption are both happening within the same entity. Cooperation amongst genders and generations is even if the actual tasks are somewhat divided, is necessary in order for the family to produce and consume. Children's labor in rural families typically has a higher value than it does in urban areas. You know, those of you, maybe some of you grew up on a farm, or you have parents or relatives who lived in a rural life, and from quite a young age, kids are engaged in doing some of the work, and taking care of some of the family's needs. So children as workers are important in rural families. Families themselves as units are often quite dependent on each other, especially with the rhythms of the agricultural year, and there's times when a great deal of labor is required, or times when things need to get done that the people in one family can't get done on their own. We see a lot more sort of mutual dependence amongst rural families typically, where you help out this family down the road, and then they come and help you out when you need it. When it's planting time, everybody works to help this person plant, and then they help you plant, and so forth. So you have denser connections often between families and households. Rural areas also, relative to urban areas, tend to be a lot more homogenous, which means on the face of it, everybody kind of looks like everybody else. Um, Cultural diversity typically does not thrive a whole lot in rural areas. It's when you get into urbanization and urban cities that you find a proliferation of different people of different cultural backgrounds, different orientations to the world, different philosophies of life, all living, together right beside each other, and thus kind of having to navigate cultural difference and living with people who aren't, may not be of your same religion, language, education, economic background, and so forth. And conversely, when urbanization happens, work and home get separated. The work that's done at home behind closed doors often becomes almost invisible labor. And this is work that is primarily, though not exclusively, done by women. We'll be talking a lot more about the invisibility of women's unpaid caregiving work within the home relative to paid work in the employed paid workforce outside the home. Families are primarily, in terms of economic activity, urban families are primarily about consumption. They are consumption units. So the urban family typically is not growing its food, in its backyard or what have you, and they're typically not sewing their own clothes or making their own whatever, except in a kind of like artisanal, hipster sort of way sometimes. So their economic activity is mainly to consume through the purchase of what they, their goods and their luxuries and so forth. We've talked about the separations of genders and generations when you no longer have as much collective effort in the home. And we should also note the changing value of children. Kids in urban societies are typically a net cost. They need, you got to buy them shoes and clothes, and you got to send them to school, and sometimes that costs money. And maybe they're involved in activities and things, and that costs money. And your kids are not out there working in the fields helping to bring the harvest in, and you can't set them tasks to do to look after the goats or whatever. So we see the value of children's labor is smaller in urban areas, and that often means that people have fewer children, which has to do with fertility transition that we'll get to later. And finally, as I mentioned just a moment ago, urban environments tend to be less homogeneous, much more diverse than rural settings and rural environments. People are exposed to many people or more people who are different from themselves with the move into cities. Okay, here's a short animated infographic thing depicting the growth of urbanization in Canada. Take a minute to click and go to the nifty little animated infographic, more like a video really, and watch the advance of urbanization within Canada and take a look at the differences amongst the regions. What differences do you note in terms of urbanization across the different regions of Canada, as you're going from west to east, for instance? Moving along, immigration. Today I want to talk about pre-war, pre-Second World War immigration, and the next week I want to talk about post-war immigration. So pre-war immigration had it peaked and it fell, and it peaked and it fell. It was like spikes and troughs, not like a steady upward line. Most immigrants to Canada during that era were coming from Europe, and the European immigration was tied to a political project pursued by successive federal governments. So this wasn't like a one party or the other thing, of getting as many white settlers into to fill up Canada as possible, especially in rural areas. So you had federal governments that were, to be honest, kind of scared of the indigenous populations. They were scared that Americans were going to be coming up from south of the border and settle or stake a claim on Canada. And they were scared that people from other parts of the world were going to arrive in Canada and start filling it up. So you have this theme running through well over 100 years of people coming to Canada, leaving their homes in Europe because they were, stressed or had to flee or what have you. But their coming to Canada was part of a sort of federal desire to make Canada as much of a white nation as possible. Here's what patterns of immigration looked like for just a few decades in that period, and here is the peak and trough pattern that I mentioned. You may be surprised to see that the peak year for immigration into Canada was not any time within living memory. Certainly long before your parents were born, or I was born, or anybody was born. It was in the period just before the First World War. That was when there was the greatest number of immigrants arriving in Canada. So we hear, you hear sometimes about immigration to Canada is increasing and there's more and more people immigrating in. We have nothing on, the 21st century has nothing on the influx of immigrants that happened to Canada before the First World War. That was the peak. Here's another from Stats Canada, a short infographic video that depicts 150 years of immigration to Canada. So it goes kind of beyond the Second World War into the 1960s. Sorry, not into the 1960s, up to 2016. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Take a moment, click on this, take a look at the short video, the information, and think about what changes you observe amongst the so-called sending countries. What patterns of change are visible when you look at where Canadian immigrants have been coming from in the last 150 years? In the early period, which is what by contrast, immigrants from other parts of the world, like Asia and Africa, were distinctly not wanted. And there's a really bad history of laws that restricted the families of Asian and African immigrants from coming and, putting down their roots and settling in Canada. We have the head tax on Chinese immigrants. Immigrants from China living in Canada had to individually pay a tax every year, which no one else had to pay. For a very long period of a couple of decades in the 20th century, Chinese immigration was stopped altogether. We do not want anybody from China immigrating to Canada, and there was no reason for that other than racism. We don't think the Chinese are the kinds of people that we want. They'll bring their families and they'll have a bunch of kids, and pretty soon everybody will be Chinese. So there was a ban on Chinese immigration for racist reasons for a while. Black families were also strongly discouraged. Even in Edmonton, this is something I came across while doing some research in the archives of the Edmonton Board of Trade, which is like the Better Business Bureau, expressing worry that too many Negroes, as they called them, were arriving in Alberta and petitioning the federal government to do something about this, like erect barriers, prevent this influx of Black people into Alberta, which they did, and Black settlers were discouraged from thinking of Alberta as a possible destination. Families from India, similarly, racist stuff going on. They were subjected to what was called the continuous journey requirement, which was that they could only immigrate, this is in the early 20th century, they could only enter Canada if they did so in one kind of non-stop trip from India to Canada. And in the days before airplanes, this effectively meant it was almost impossible. If they stopped anywhere on the ocean voyage or anywhere overland on their way to Canada, they were deemed to have interrupted their continuous journey, and they would not be allowed to immigrate to Canada. So it was a policy that was racist in its effect, and that it effectively prevented Indian families, except for the ones who could find a way to get a boat that would take them straight from India to Canada, to prevent them from coming to Canada. Jewish families, the sort of shameful thing here is the anti-Semitism of Canada was manifested in the years leading up to World War II, the rise of Hitler in Germany, where Jewish families seeking refugee status, seeking to come to Canada to save their lives, were turned away. And this is sort of a notorious statement by a federal politician at the time, when he was asked how many Jews will we accept who are fleeing from Hitler. He said none is too many. In other words, we're not taking anybody at all. We don't want Jews to immigrate to Canada. So a whole lot of people were distinctly not wanted in Canada for a long time. Here's a short story about the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the period of time when Chinese immigration to Canada was just explicitly stopped. It's an interview with an elderly woman in Vancouver, where she talks about the impacts of the Chinese Exclusion Act on herself and her family. And this is still, for her, that this is her living memory. It's not, history, something that happened a long time ago. So take a moment to hear what she has to say. And now we get to social reform, which is the final of the big historical trends in pre-World War II Canada that I'd like to talk about today. So social reform movements in Canada started arising late 19th, early 20th century as a response to what was perceived as crises of poverty, sickness, vice, immoral, bad living, and so forth occurring, happening in communities throughout Canada. Political leaders, religious leaders, the health workers, health scientists of the day sought to change and to intervene, to use government power to intervene and change, and again, I'm doing the air quote thing, improve the lives of Canadian families. One historian of the time refers to this period as the age of light, soap, and water, referring to the sort of promotion of new ways of thinking and hygiene practices and just the mobilization of state resources, government resources to these projects of social uplift, some of which were really good and some of which left a lot to be desired. This was a time when movements within science, within religion, within politics were gaining ground. Within science, we have the rise of the germ theory of disease. People started to understand how infectious disease spreads, and therefore the importance of cleanliness. Evolution, although it was contested, that this belief that people are constantly evolving and we can evolve towards becoming better, and the rise of psychology, that what we think and what we feel are not just these kind of mysterious things that happen, but are actually produced by the environments that we live in. This sort of scientific enthusiasm of the late 19th, early 20th century led to a lot of these social reform movements. Within religion, especially Christianity, which was the dominant religion in Canada, comes this idea of the, in quote, social gospel. That the religious teachings are not just about, God and heaven and the afterlife, but they are meant, the work of religion and the work of Christianity is to change conditions to make life better in the here and now. So social gospel was sort of a shorthand for applying religious imperatives and principles and resources towards the improvement of life, especially for people that were poor or oppressed or otherwise marginalized. And it was controversial. You had religious leaders saying, no, whatever happens on earth is because God wants it to be that way and has a plan, and we should just be keeping our minds focused on purely spiritual and things about, the next world. And within politics, you have a rise in socialism, even in places which are today really conservative, like Alberta. You have in the teens and 20s the rise of sort of prairie and agrarian socialism, desire for redistribution of wealth and redistribution of the benefits of society more evenly throughout the population. And that also drove reform movements. Here's a little clip about J.S. Woodsworth, whom you may have heard of. He is a classic. He is a typical early 20th century reformer. Many things that we have in Canada that benefit families today, like Medicare and family benefits and so forth, trace their origins back to people like Woodsworth. He firmly comes out of the social gospel tendency within Christianity. And if he was around today, we'd call him a social justice warrior. He'd be like this woke dude going around trying to make all of these changes and reforms and improve the lives of people and their families. So take a moment to check out J.S. Woodsworth. What did the social reform movements achieve? Well, they achieved some pretty important things for families, as we shall see. Rights for women within families, the right to divorce, for instance, the right to be free from domestic violence. All of these had their origins in those days. social gospel efforts, especially, or social reform efforts, especially in the area of health and hygiene, led to a lot of reductions in infant mortality. You know, infants were not dying as much of preventable diseases, contagious diseases, better understanding of child welfare and well-being. We see the first laws intended. Oh, there's my cat. Okay, now she's exiting. Um, of laws that were meant to protect children from exploitation, so child labor laws and so forth, emerge at this time. So the rights of children were safeguarded. But what we also see, which was not so great, is through these legal means a lot of reinforcement of the idea of separate spheres, you know, men's world, women's world, um, which has many, as we'll see in the next few weeks, consequences for Canadian families, not all of which are uniformly positive. So that kind of brings us up to the Second World War. And in the next set of lectures, we will look at what was going on, the profound changes to families after that war, which kind of set the backdrop to what we see today in 2020. So I will, you'll hear from me again next week with the next set of lectures. Okay, bye for now.